Hey guys, welcome to another episode of T's Creative Ramblings, and today I'm back with another video. Now today we are going to be diving back into the wargaming genre for Thursday's wargaming video, and today is a particularly special episode because this came as a request from one of my subscribers, and I'm really grateful for the request. Please, if you do have any requests at any point, do throw them down in the comments. It's the only way I know what you would like me to talk about. Otherwise I'll just keep making my own content and enjoying it, which of course is what I will do anyway. But if you want to get some input into the sort of videos that I'm making, do please throw a comment below. So today's episode, as I say, is special, and we're going to be looking specifically at the question of basing figures. A lot of people sort of have been doing it and probably do it without even thinking about it. But for those who are new to the hobby, I thought it might be good to tackle the question of what materials do you use when you base your figures. So today we're going to tackle 5 materials that you could use when basing your figures. So without further ado, let's jump down to the workbench and let's take a look at those materials and see what you can do for your basing. Alright guys, and welcome to the workbench. So as I said in the introduction, we're going to be looking at basing today and what I use when I'm basing my figures. Now I should add, I tend to only base figures. I don't base vehicles unless we're talking about ships, which we will cover shortly. So in front of me, we've got 5 different materials that you could use for creating your texture on your base and setting the scenes with that basing. These aren't all of the techniques, but these are probably the majority of the ones that are used out and about in the wargaming sort of hobby. And what we'll do is we'll go through each of these individually and look at some examples of bases that I've done with these materials. I will just caveat, the cork here is the only thing that I haven't actually used yet on basing, but looking at some GW Games Workshop sort of Warhammer videos online, I do know that cork is from time to time used on their bases, whether it's sort of building up a rocky or broken up ground sort of base, maybe with a hero stepping up onto sort of a rocky area. Often cork is used. And I should also say at this point that I have previously done a video on bases in my bolt action basics playlist, so do check that out. I will try to throw a link to that in the description below, and basically that just looks at the different types of bases that you could use, whether you're looking at plastic bases, metal bases, or MDF wooden bases. It will depend on sort of the basing that you use, but primarily all of these techniques or all of the materials that I'm going to show today can be used on any type of base really. Okay, so let's jump into our first example and we'll look at PVA glue and the good old basic sand. Okay, so here we have probably my preferred type of basing. This is one that I've used more recently. Basically what I will do is I will take the base, I will put down some PVA glue, neat, a sort of not too thick a layer on the base, and then what I will do is sprinkle the sand over the base to get a coverage. Now for smaller scales I will use sort of finer sand, so if I'm doing 2 mils, 6 mil, very fine. If I'm using larger figures like 10 mil upwards really, I will use maybe something like a sharp sand which has a little bit of grit in and gives us things like rocks. And you can see on this figure here, I'll just bring him up to the camera, he's got some rocks around his feet there. So what I'll do is I'll take the base, as I say, bit of glue on it, scatter it. Once I've done that, I can then prime the base with the figures on in my black primer or whatever color primer I'm using, and that will give me a base color for the base. I then will paint that over with the chosen color, maybe a brown, something like that. And then, as I have done on this base, I will just dry brush the base with like a cream color, and that will, particularly if you're using sharp sand, that will pick out the larger pieces, the raised areas. And then on top of that, I can then use some flock or scatter and any tufts that I might want to use as well. And what I'll do is I'll just drop a picture in now, a close-up of those three bases, so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. And this is probably, again, one of the most common techniques used by wargamers. It's relatively cheap in terms of picking up a bag of sand. You can get a bag of sand that will last you life, essentially, for under £10 easily. Or some people might be lucky enough to go down to the beach and get some sand off the beach. It's easily picked up. So that is the sand technique, and as I say, I do use that for most of my figures nowadays. So let's move now on to polyfiller. Okay, so the next material that we're going to look at is polyfiller, and this is a material that I used quite a bit previously. It's really easy to get just a little trowel or a little screwdriver or something like that, and just cover the top of the base with it. What you can see here is just a small little piece of terrain. This is for Vietnam, a little booby trap with some pungy sticks in it, but I've basically just covered the edges with the polyfiller, and I was able to, as it was drying, take a finger that dipped in water and just smooth it out, and it gives quite a good texture. Or you can leave it quite rough. The other thing you can do, particularly with something like ships when you're creating water, again, is using either a knife or a little trowel or any sort of tool for modeling. You can use it to create sort of waves and bits like that. So polyfiller can be very good for that. And just putting it on, you can get a very rough, uneven surface, which once dry, will take primer, it will take brown paint, it will take any paint really, and of course you'll get some dry brushing off that as well, because you'll get some high parts to it because it's rough and uneven unless smoothed out. And of course, if you want something smooth, like maybe a tarmac base, if you're doing an urban setting, then this could be quite useful, because you can easily sort of make some cracks in it once it has dried. If you're looking at potholes, you can dig bits out of it, and it is a really good material for modeling different ground covers, even if you're not just doing like a standard mud field or something like that. You can really do a good job on the modeling with this and create some really interesting effects. So that is polyfiller. We'll move on to green stuff next. So one of the most expensive ways to create bases is to use green stuff. And if you've not come across green stuff before, you can get it from various different companies. This one's from the Army Painter, but you can get them from other companies too. And essentially, it's a two-part epoxy, I believe, which you essentially cut off an even amount of each, and you roll it together until it turns into a dark green color, as you can see on the bases here. Now, again, I will put pictures up of these figures, but this stuff is really quite good in the sense that you could put it over a base, and I used to do this quite religiously on all my figures, and use that to create a textured ground. Now, the only reason I use it nowadays, and again, it's an expensive thing, is to create something specific. So here I've tried to create with 10mm figures a sort of a dug-in look to this mortar team. Not particularly dug in to the ground particularly deep, but it's something to give it a little bit of a lip. Over on this next base, I've used green stuff to create some sandbags, to create a sandbagged position for the mortars. And then on these two 28mm figures, what I've done is I've covered the ground and then used essentially a part of a pen, which has a circular, almost cutter-like shape, to press into the green stuff and give it the look of a cobbled street. And then obviously with a half decent paint job as well, you really can create that look of somewhere like, I don't know, 1940s France or even London. You can really get an idea of sort of a cobbled street. And so for that technique, it's really quite useful, and something that you might want to experiment with. Next, we're going to move on to some texture paints. All right, so next we have these texture paints. These are specifically from Vallejo, but I believe other companies do various texture paints as well. Essentially, it's paint with sand poured into it, given it a good mix, and then sold for a nice price. These I have used in the past. I don't tend to use them much nowadays. Again, the price of these isn't too bad and they will last a relatively good time, but it does get your brushes quite clogged up. So I don't like using them all that much. Saying that, I did a whole 28mm British 8th Army desert for World War II, and all the bases I used this desert sand texture paint. So it's certainly not a bad way of doing basing. And I've asked these 4 volunteers to come and join us today to demonstrate the brown earth texture paint here that I've used. A bit difficult to see under the flock and tufts that I've put on it, and again I will put the picture up now just for you to see. But essentially, once you've well, you can pretty much do it whenever. I tended to do it after I'd painted the figure. I'd then paint on the texture paint onto the base. It's very quick. It gives you texture and it gives you that colour. All you need to do, if you want, is to do a dry brush over the top, and essentially that's your basing done. Nice, easy and simple technique to do. Some people I know really like this because it essentially is a really easy way of doing basing, and it might be something you consider if you're not all that keen on using sand, or you don't want to be going to the expense of something like green stuff. Polyfiller is relatively cheap, but again, doesn't give you the colour that these texture paints do, and they come in other colours as well as desert sand and brown earth. I believe there's a water one as well, and I think other companies do other colours as well, sort of more of a red oxide sort of colour as well, if you're doing something a bit spacey, you want to create Mars or something. So that's a really good way that I would recommend, possibly for people new to the hobby if you're not keen on basing. And this is a quick and simple way of getting your figures based up. So next we'll move on to some the last technique, which is to use the cork, and we'll talk about that. All right, so here we have the cork. I'm not going to talk too long about this because, as I said earlier, it's not a technique I use a huge amount. In fact, I'm not even sure I've got any examples where I've used cork. But this stuff is really good because you can easily tear it into the shapes you want. And when you tear it, you get a rough edge, which makes it more natural looking. So if you're looking to do sort of a rock plateau or some built up rock, something like that, you could use it for sort of masonry debris, stuff like that. And it's very easy to tear, to glue down, to build up on top of each other, and place your figure, maybe in a pose standing on top of it, or maybe around your figure. You could even maybe put your figure attached to something in between it, so it looks like he's sort of stepping across cracked ground. Anything like that, you can get really creative about it. But ultimately, again, this you could even incorporate with a bit of filler or a bit of green stuff or a bit of texture paint, or once you've you know, once you've done like a base coat over it, you could paint over it. You could add sand onto it as well, and you can mix all of these materials up on one base to use multiple materials and get different effects. I've seen it done, and I've seen it done well, so something to consider. Now, hopefully this has been of help to people watching. I will do another episode about different types of flock, and because you can get static grass, you can get fine turfs, you can get tufts, lots of different bits that you could get to add onto your bases. So once you've painted them, how do you make them that much better? So I'll do another video on that, but hopefully you found this helpful. If you have, do please hit that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please consider hitting the subscribe button. It really does make a difference. Costs you nothing, but means the world to me as I get closer to my target of 1,000 subscribers this year. So until next time, guys, you take care, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.